For the past few weeks, conservatives have been debating whether to vote for Donald Trump after he softened his pro-life stances and even used phrases like reproductive rights and championing taxpayer-funded IVF. Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things, recently wrote about how the Republican Party has sided with the pro-life cause. So he joins us now. So Rusty, thanks so much. Before we dive into all of the pro-life issues, there's so much at stake.
Indeed.
In this election. So what are some of these potential consequences of this one?
We all feel that there's a kind of referendum about what kind of country we're going to have going forward, or even the future of Western civilization. Rapid demographic change, declines in fertility. We're undergoing some pretty dramatic cultural changes. And I think that I go into the election thinking that it's not just a decision about policy. It's really a kind of spiritual, cultural decision about what kind of country, what kind of civilization we're going to have. You could sort of put it globalist notion that an ever more open, fluid world, or a reconsolidation around our own traditions and our own way of life. I see that as the kind of big choice that we face as a country.
So the stakes are high indeed.
But it's a paradoxical moment, though. We feel the stakes are high, but at the same time, it's kind of amazing that there's also a kind of a certain complacency out there. I have a hard time figuring out which is more powerful, the sense of dread and anxiety, or the complacency and the feeling like, well, nothing's really going to change.
Yeah, and we should get into that. I think one of the things that does strike me among the people who aren't complacent is that I think more than any time in my lifetime, there may be less of them, or there may be more people who are complacent, right? The people who aren't seem to be talking about this as some kind of spiritual battle in a way that's simultaneously alarming and surprising.
Well, why would you think it's surprising? It does seem as though, the typical New York Times reader just has a fundamentally different worldview than the typical Trump voter. They're almost as if we're living in separate realities. And that kind of clash is what I think creates this feeling that, the future of the country is at stake, which I think is correct. But on the other hand, Trump was elected in 2016, and we had this kind of chaotic election in 2020. So I think a lot of people are thinking, well, it doesn't really matter. Nothing's really going to change. The fix is in. And I think those are at war with each other. The feeling we've got to actually take measures. We got to take a stand versus the feeling of impotence and that the oligarchy is too strong for us, or the technocratic elites are too strong. They lock down the country. They can lock us down, lock down our descent from their governance of our country.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the complacence is acquiescence. I mean, it's like, it's over. I give up. And that does seem to be the case even in terms of the way audiences respond, right? Or readers.
Yes.
To publications such as yours. And so, I mean, before we leave this, I want to get your take. Do you think then that if there's more complacency, does that mean that the people who aren't complacent are more zealous than in the past?
I think if you look at the country, there are, I would say, 20% of the electorate is rabidly progressive, and they think that they're angry that we cannot realize an ever more inclusive, ever more diverse country. And another 20% of the electorate is very mobilized in an effort to try to reconsolidate the country, close the border, repatriate industry to the country, reestablish marriage and family as the normative center for life. But that leaves 60% of the population in the middle, and I think they don't really quite know which way to go. And that's why it's going to be, I think, a close election. I mean, the polling indicates that, and that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Because those two 20% are are really at loggerheads with each other. So people talk about civil war. I think that's overblown, precisely because the middle 60% is not engaged in the same passionate way that the two sides are. But it is by the end of the decade, I think we will be going either one direction or the other as a country.
Let's dive into what you are very versed in, which is the topic of abortion. And
Yes.
the Republicans this time around, it would seem that we would be in the best position that we ever have been, because Donald Trump was out there and he can claim to be the president that overturned Roe. And yet we find ourselves here in this election cycle having a bigger debate about where the Republican Party should stand on this issue. And actually, for the first time, I believe in 40 years, it wasn't explicitly written into the Republican platform. So what is your take on what's happening right now with this election cycle in this topic?
Well, Dobbs exposed the sad fact that the majority of Americans, maybe 60% of Americans, maybe 65% of Americans, are okay with abortion. Now, they'll get very squeamish about late-term abortion, but they do not want to see abortion outlawed in the United States. So they may even believe that life begins at conception, but they still don't want to have abortion limited in a significant way. And that's a sad fact. And it's been very demoralizing to me as a proponent of the sanctity of life. But that doesn't mean we're unmanned. I do think that there are, Florida, there's a referendum, Missouri, some other states. And I do think, we can get some wins in some red states that will allow us to stabilize the anxiety and the fear that the politicians have, that this is, a lot of Republican politicians think, I just want to get away from this issue. It's just a loser. But I would point out that there's none of the governors who signed legislation restricting abortion after Dobbs, none of those governors have suffered political consequences. DeSantis was reelected by a strong margin. So I'm not convinced that the pro-life cause is a liability across the board for the Republican Party. We need some wins in these state referenda to stabilize the situation and figure out how to rebuild a consensus in America in favor of the culture of life.
Yeah, so go to drill in on that, because how should evangelicals and Catholics respond? I mean, how should the coalition respond in the wake of this? I see a lot of lame response and then sort of screaming and crying that we're not getting our way. And
Yes.
so what's the strategy moving forward, do you think?
Well, I think there are two things to keep in mind. One is we're going to vote in early November, and we have a choice. And we may not like Donald Trump's retreat from a strong pro-life stance, but the alternative is a radical pro-abortion Democratic Party. So I have no question, I have no qualms of conscience in voting for Donald Trump on the grounds that his administration is more likely to defend life than would a Democratic Party administration. The second thing is that we can work at the state level, at the local level, to continue to support pro-life politicians, bring them up through the system. And so there's work to be done and can be done in this electoral cycle to stand behind Republican politicians who are willing to take a strong pro-life stance.
Yeah, this is just a way of commenting. It drives me nuts that Roe v. Wade is overturned, and you'd think, right, immediately it'd be, I always heard it's the equivalent to free state and slave state and all this my whole life. So you'd think there'd be an enormous rush of attention into these states to now that's where the real work is, and to do the real work, which would be developing those politicians, developing those pro-life policies, some of which are negative, some of which are positive,
Yes.
right? Develop a pro-family agenda in the red states where you can, and you would think you would see that. And on the voting aspect, I've never understood this with fellow Republicans, or I guess sometimes I'm a Republican. I vote that way mostly because I have to, but I've never understood the moral case for voting. It's hilarious to me. And the way I always like to say it at cocktail parties is, look, if I'm Christian in Syria, I vote for Assad so I don't get my head chopped off. Like, this isn't a moral statement, right? I mean, there's two candidates, and if you can influence the better outcome, I'm going to do that. This is not complicated.
And it's not just on the life issue, but I think it has to do with religious freedom and the pressures put on Christians throughout the country under a Democratic administration. So I think you're right. The Assad analogy, it's extreme, but it's accurate to our situation. I mean, the prosecution of the fellow who got into the altercation in front of the abortion clinic in Philadelphia, that kind of prosecution would not happen under, no matter what Donald Trump says about his positions on the restriction of abortion, that kind of prosecution would not happen in a Trump administration and a Trump Justice Department. And that's significant.
How do you see it playing out this time around, Rusty?
You mean the
election this time?
You know, I work as hard as I can not to think about
Fair enough.
About the election. One of my, we had the Democratic convention, the euphoria for Kamala Harris, and my friends are all wringing their hands. And I said, just be patient. These electoral cycles. You go from one thing to the next. Events, the rise and fall. It's going to be a close election. I think that Trump will win. Partly because I think there's continued underestimation of his support. There's still a kind of shyness of people because of how much shame is heaped upon those who support Trump. So I think it's not as strong as it was in 2016, but it's still there. So I'm hopeful that he will prevail in November. And I mean, part of my thinking on this, or my emotional state, is I do enjoy the thought of all those good people being so sad and crying.
See, you had an answer this whole time, and you were trying to hold out on us, Rusty. Thanks so much for joining us in studio today.